Hello and welcome to Mel Make Stuff. My name is Melissa and this is episode number 11. Before we get started, I just want to welcome everybody who is new to the podcast. I know there's a lot of new viewers that have come over from Amy Pelko and from Selma's podcast, so if you're new, welcome, and if you've been here for a while, welcome back. I have one finished object and about 5 whips that I want to try to get through today, so let's get right into things. The first finished object I want to talk to you about is what I am wearing, which is the Oak Cardigan by Marie Wallen. I have been working on this for some time. I did finish it back in January and it's just taken me a little while to get around to recording this episode. The last video that I put out, which is not number 10, but an in-between video that is about the finishing of this cardigan, really went into a lot of the details of the finishing. So picking up the stitches for the button bands, the steeking, the sewing things together, and how I finished my seams on the inside. I'll show you some finished shots of this as I'm giving you sort of the basic details one final time. This pattern is out of Marie Wallen's Wildwood book, which is a wonderful book. I really have to recommend it at this point. I had such a great time knitting this sweater. And I think this was the first book that used her British Breeds yarn, which is the yarn that I also used for this project. I used exactly the colors as written in the pattern, except for the natural color, which I substituted with Jamieson and Smith 2006. I made the size medium, which is meant to fit a 36 to a 38 bust. My bust is around a 35, but because I have broad shoulders, I decided to size up instead of down. The pattern as written in the book is meant to be knitted flat, and I have gone over this in the last couple of episodes, but I knitted mine in the round with steeks for both the armholes and the front opening, and I also knitted the sleeves in the round with steeks, but then I seamed them at the end. So more about that in the previous video about this cardigan, which I will link below. In the video about the finishing of this cardigan, I was a little bit worried that the front bands would curl too much for my liking, and same with the bottom hem, but it's actually fine. You can see it's laying pretty flat. There is a little bit, like it does want to curl out a little bit, but it never gets to the point of actually flipping out, so I think that this is fine. The sleeve rib is not curling out at all. I have zero problem with the way this is finished. I really am happy with that. And same with the hem here. It's not really curling at all. I did press this with my iron. So that is something to note about the way that a lot of these garments are finished. Marie Wallen actually suggests this as a finishing technique in her book. She says to steam it with your iron. And what I do is a little bit more drastic than what she does. She suggests that you iron against the wrong side of the fabric and you never actually press down with your iron on the fabric. It's more of like a steaming and then patting into place. What I do is go ham with the iron. I will actually take like a washcloth or a hand towel or a dish towel, something that has a good amount of surface area. I will wet it and then wring it out in the sink, and then I will actually iron. I'll spread my garment out right side out, and then I will put that wet towel down over the top of the garment, and then I will steam it, like with pressure on the iron on that cloth. Now, I wouldn't recommend this if you were at all worried about any of the colors bleeding. This is something that I do post blocking, so I wet block this entire thing to finish it, and then after that I pressed it. And so this pressing technique, I would be very careful unless you are 100% sure that your yarn is not going to bleed, and also make sure to not have your iron too hot. I'll usually put mine somewhere in the middle, like on the wool setting. Doing something like this can be extremely risky. When you have wet wool and also heat and synthetic dyes, which is what is used in this yarn, there can be some budging of the color, and you really don't want that, obviously, after having finished this entire garment. I tested on my swatch. I was reasonably sure this would be fine. I checked it after each press with the iron to make sure that nothing was looking bad, and it turned out looking really good. So I liked that finishing technique for this. Any lumps and bumps in the fabric really get smoothed out, and it also definitely did help these bands relax a little bit so that they're not wanting to curl out. As far as the size that I chose, I did size up for my bust like I mentioned, and I am glad I did that because I think this is fitting right as I want it to. The outside of the sleeve is just at the point of my shoulder, and for a cardigan like this, I think I like that fit right about there. Just give you a little bit of a close-up of the fit around the arm side. It's perfect. I really am happy with how this fits in this area because this is just sort of a problem area for me with having a small bust for my shoulder width. I am never 100% sure how that set-in sleeve shape is going to be on me, but I really am happy with this. There's enough ease under here that I can wear a t-shirt and have it be comfortable, but it's not too big, and I still have a very good range of motion there with my arm. One thing that you will want to note if you are planning to make any of the sweaters in this book is to really check out that sleeve length and whether it's going to work for you. You can maybe see in this photo from the book that the sleeve length on this model is actually a little short, and it's hitting her at a bracelet length, which is fine if that is what you're going for. But again, there's something about this that just makes those sleeves look a little bit too short to me, and I don't know if that was intentional or if that's just sort of the way the sweater is fitting on this model, but the sleeves maybe are not going to be quite to your liking as far as the length, depending on your arm length. And this is something that's a little bit trickier to adjust for when you have an all-over colorwork pattern all the way down the sleeve. For my size, the sleeve length from the underarm to the wrist was supposed to be 17.5 inches as written. I have short arms, so unlike probably most people watching this, so I'm 5'2", and I have short arms for my size. So I'm always having to shorten sleeves, and so that was a concern for me since the beginning, was how was I going to change this pattern so that it would maintain the look of this, all of these motifs being in order, but shorten them just a little bit. After I had finished the body and cut the steeks, I had tried this on, and I took a measurement from where this was hitting me on my body to how long I thought the sleeve needed to be. And so I decided that my sleeve ideally needed to be 17 inches, not 17.5. So it's a small adjustment, but it's something that can make a big difference in a fitted garment. I really didn't want the sleeve to be so long that it was bunching up on my hand, because I wanted a really clean fitted look for this garment and not really have a bunch of extra fabric hanging around. Based on my row gauge for this project, I figured that I only needed to eliminate maybe 5 or 6 rounds, and so from there I started considering all of my options. Here you can see the chart for this garment goes from the bottom of this X and O motif, or X and flower motif here, all the way up through this darker motif that with the blue and purple here. So it's quite a long pattern repeat. And then within that we have 4 other motifs that are of varying widths. With me needing to cut out only 5 or 6 rounds, I could have cut them straight off the bottom and maybe started this somewhere in the middle of this flower. But then that's a little bit more than 5 rounds here, and my cuff would have needed to be a little bit longer than I thought would look good proportionally, so I ruled that out. Then I was thinking maybe I could eliminate like this motif, which is a little bit smaller, but that still is too many rows, and then it would disrupt the look of the overall pattern. And so what I decided to do, which is very subtle, I'm gonna have to even figure out where I did this, but I just took out 1 row here and there where I thought it made sense in the pattern, until I had, I forget if it was 5 or 6 rounds shorter for this sleeve. So I basically followed the pattern as written, but I just found places where I could eliminate 1 row and have it not disrupt the overall look. One of those places was right here at the beginning. There was supposed to be another round of this natural color. I took that out. Is this another one? Yeah, here's another one. So you can see this is another X, like these blue X's here in this pattern. This band here has 3 rows for that blue X, and up here there's only 2, so I eliminated the last round of this X. Things like that. So there are some rounds up here. In this section here, there were areas where there were 2 dark brown rounds together. I took 1 out of each of those sections. So that sort of thing is what I did to preserve the overall look of this sleeve, but get it to be a little bit shorter so that it would fit my arm. Here you can see what that motif is actually supposed to look like with 3 rows of blue. 3 rows of blue. So I did the same thing again up here, and even though these are right next to each other on the body, you don't really notice it. This is so busy that it just sort of fools the eye, and I was able to accomplish getting a shorter sleeve, but you don't really notice that the pattern is cut off there. So if you're finding that you have either shorter or longer arms than whatever overall colorwork pattern is written for, if you need to either add or subtract just a little bit of length, I think this is a really good way to do it. If you're making this and you're on the taller side especially, you'll really want to check beforehand to see where you need to add rows. If you need to add so many based on your row gauge that it is worth adding in the next sort of motif to make that sleeve longer. So for this pattern, you know, the sleeve as written ends here, and you might want to add either half or some part of this motif here. You definitely want to get that figured out before you get too far into the sleeve, because once you're at the point where the underarm shaping starts, that part of the arm has to match up with what's on the body, otherwise it's not going to look right. So any adjustments that you make have to happen below this point, and this is just one of those things where you have to plan it out before you start, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but if you look at your gauge that you're getting on the body for your rows, you should be able to calculate relatively easily how many more or less rows you might need to add here. I am using this little pin to hold this together, which is something that I got on Etsy, so I will link the shop below. So that is the oak cardigan. After all of the changes that I made to this, and after how perfectly it turned out, I am really feeling like I can do anything right now. Like, that's probably a dangerous place to be, because I'm gonna start trying really crazy stuff, but that's how I'm feeling right now, so I'm just like riding that wave. My first work in progress that I have to talk about is the Vare pullover by Gudrun Johnston. This is the cover sweater of her Shetland Trader book, the latest one that just came out. I'm sure you are seeing this everywhere because it seems like all the podcasters are making it, and this is one of those times where I am jumping on the bandwagon. I had shown my swatch for this in the last episode, so let me get it. Here we go. So I am using for my background color a Green Mountain Spinnery yarn. The base is called Lana. It's a dark green. I'm not sure how well it's coming across on camera. And then I have this natural color, yellow and pink. These are all contrast colors from Bartlett yarns up in Maine. And then here you can see where I was testing out a couple of different browns to use. So this was my original pick down here, this darker one. There is not enough contrast there, so I am instead using this lighter sort of tan, which is a color that I had left over from my boho sweater. And this is a Jamieson's of Shetland colorway of some sort. And here is where I am. So I have gotten quite some way, and it's been a little while since I've talked to you. So I am doing the version that has side shaping. I'm doing like the full-on 70s razor shell, all the different colors used. And then now I am up here in the colorwork section, and here are my armhole steeks. So let me talk to you a little bit about the construction of this. So the entire bottom part of this sweater is done in this razor shell, which is a very simple pattern that is essentially a garter stitch lace. And so what that means, because you're knitting this in the round, is that you're knitting garter stitch in the round. And unlike garter stitch flat, which is knit both on the right and the wrong sides, in the round you are always looking at the right side, so you knit one round and then you purl one round. That might turn this into a lot of purling for folks who don't like purling. I don't mind purling, but one way that I imagine you could probably get around that is to knit this section, the razor shell section, flat and then seam it. If you really hated garter stitch in the round that much, that is something that you could do. I knit this as written with the side shaping as written, and I am making this with 0 ease, which is a little bit terrifying for me. I am not a 0 ease or a negative ease person, and so this is a little bit foreign to me. The bust circumference for this size, which is the second size, is 89 centimeters or 35 inches, and that's exactly my bust measurement. And I'm like, I hope this fits. I'm not super worried about it because, first of all, I think that it will. I am getting gauge. I checked my gauge using my swatch. I've checked my gauge since I've started knitting it, so I think that that will be okay. The other reason that I'm not too stressed out about that is because there's really not a whole lot of knitting from the point where these armhole steeks start to where the shoulders are. And so if this ends up really catastrophically not fitting me for whatever reason around the upper bust, I can just rip back just to the top of this razor shell and do a bigger size from here up if I really need to. Again, I don't think that's gonna happen. This feels stretchy enough. I am not a tight colorwork knitter. I know that I leave my floats loose enough, and just to give you an example of what that looks like, you can really see, like, my floats are so loose as to sometimes be like, they look like smiles on the inside, and that for me has always worked out in terms of my tension. It is not so loose that it looks sloppy from the right side, but it gives the fabric enough give that it's not really, I'm not worried about my color work being too tight. This pattern is extremely well written, and as I have been going through this, I've been thinking that this would actually be a great pattern if it was your first time steeking a garment. If you're really, really, truly afraid of steeking, I would definitely suggest starting with something that's not going to go in your body, like, I don't know, I feel like everybody starts with some kind of cup holder, like a steeked cup holder or something. I've never done one of those, but something like that. I know that there are a couple shawls out there that are like colorwork shawls that you then cut open and finish the edges, and then you have like a colorwork shawl, and that's less important if you're worried about fit on your body, obviously. But the reason that I say that I think this would be a good first steeked garment is because this pattern is extremely well written. It is not like a breathe here, blink here type pattern, but it just gives you exactly the information that you need and not a whole lot else. So it's easy to follow. You have a range of sizes that will fit a lot of the population with this pattern. There are a lot of different variables that you can change out. So you don't have to go full on 70s with this. You can do all one color here if you want. You could even knit the whole body in stockinette if you didn't want this razor shell at all, which I understand. We all had like something like this in our families that if we were around for the 70s or if we inherited it from somebody who was, you know. So I understand like this type of lace very specifically says 70s to me, and I like that. It might not be for everybody. You can make a straight-sided garment here, so you don't have to have the shaping if you don't want. Here is a side view of where the shaping happens, so you can see it gradually comes in here, gradually back out. This is actually sort of at the underbust point where it hits on me, so that I think will tend to be a lot of folks' smallest point on their body, and so it will hit, yeah, right just below the bust when I'm wearing it. But you can easily take that shaping out if you don't like it. You can make it longer if you don't want such a cropped length. I'm making the cropped length as written because I do like that. And then once you get to the color work, this is actually very beginner friendly too, and let me explain what I mean. So when you're looking at this pattern, you can see there are not long stretches of any one color. You have both colors being used in relatively small motifs across the entire design. So you are not really ever going to be in a situation where you need to catch your float on the back. You can just knit the color work as it comes. So that is one thing that makes this very beginner friendly. The other thing, if you for whatever reason your gauge was so out, you didn't check it at all, and you're just not paying attention to anything that you're doing, I'm sure this is none of us out there, right? But if you happen to get to the point where you cut these armhole steeks and put this on and it didn't fit you because your color work was too tight, I mean, that's going to be the problem most of the time color work gets screwed up, you would only have to rip back down to here and you could just put all these stitches back on the needle and re-knit this. It uses very little yarn of your contrast colors. I mean, I'm using hardly any of these contrast colors, and it feels a little ridiculous because I bought full skeins of yarn at Rhinebeck for this project. Like, I'm pretty much done with the color work and I still have this much of these skeins here. So unless you were trying to get this done with real scraps, you could easily re-knit this if you needed to. Other nice things about the pattern are that there are multiple different sleeve options. You don't have to do these balloon sleeves like on the cover of the pattern. I am doing the balloon sleeves because hell yeah, but you could do a straight sleeve, and it also has a couple different neck options. You can do a turtleneck or a crew neck. You can also use a real variety of different yarns for this. I am using something that is relatively close to what is suggested in the pattern. And actually, this contrast color here is Jamieson's, I think this is Jamieson's of Shetland, but Jamieson and Smith is what's recommended in the book, which is effectively exactly the same as this. It's just a nice light fingering woolen spun yarn. So this is the only color I'm using that is quite like this. Here's another skein of my main color yarn. This is the Green Mountain Spinnery yarn. Hopefully you can see it's a dark green, but it's got blues and yellows in here. Just beautiful. This is also woolen spun, and here you can see that it is a pretty comparable thickness and type of yarn. It also has 2 plies. It is not a particularly soft yarn, but it's not scratchy either. It's just really perfect for this sort of thing. And then the Bartlett, which is another yarn I have used before many times, is actually a little bit thicker. They up at the Bartlett mill in Maine spin using a spinning mule, which is a very old school spinning machine, and it's the only one left in the US of its type. I have seen one in person at the Wallin mills in Ireland. It's fantastic. If you ever get the chance to tour one of these mills, it's worth, I mean, you're really transported back in time by this particular machine. But what ends up happening, the spinning mule makes a very lofty and sort of slightly more irregular yarn. And so it's here up close, these three look like they're relatively the same thickness, but in person, the Bartlett is just a little bit thicker. I am not finding that it's making a big difference in terms of the appearance of the fabric. The contrast color doesn't look super thick next to the background color, but I can feel that it is. So I think that that will probably even itself out a little bit with blocking, but it is just sort of interesting to note. I have seen other folks using everything from like a very smooth superwash yarn to this type of thing to make this sweater. And I think you could pretty much use any sort of yarn, and this pattern here will look amazing. If you're using a smoother yarn up here, you would just want to finish that steek in some way before you cut it. And by that I mean probably want to use your sewing machine to sew. So you can see my vertical steek stitch columns here. If you were using a superwash yarn, might want to sew a line of machine stitching down here and then cut in between that machine stitching, and then you'd be totally fine, good to go. This yarn I am not going to finish at all before I cut it. I'm just going to cut right into it. I am not worried about this unraveling or pulling apart at all. Now that I have shown this to you, I am going to finish the body, cut the steeks for the arms, and try it on at that point, make sure everything is fitting right. And then the sleeves are knit from the top down, which is nice. They're not knit from the bottom up and sewn in. She has you pick up stitches around the armhole and knit the sleeve cap in. I think she said she was inspired by Elizabeth Doherty, that book that I'm constantly talking about with the top down set in sleeve construction. So I have made garments like that before. So if I'm remembering that correctly, I should be good to go on these sleeves. And then this much fabric right here in this balloon sleeve is gonna take forever to knit. So there is that. But once I get into the sleeves, this is gonna be my Zoom meeting knitting. So that will give me something to do. I like this flat lay on the back of the book here. This is the original sweater from Gudrun's mother's company from back in the day. And then here is her new version. So it's just cool to see that. The next project I have to show you is a pair of socks. And I know, like, I don't really show socks on the podcast. I'm not really a sock knitter. I went through a couple of years of knitting just tons of socks, and now I have enough, so I only knit them, like I'll maybe knit 2 pairs a year, 2 to 3 pairs, to replenish old pairs as they wear out, or I will knit them for gifts. My mother-in-law loves hand-knitted socks, and we're still building up her sock wardrobe, so I knit socks now and then, but you won't see them pop up too often. I have 1/2 of the pair done. These are the Furrow Socks. It's a free pattern on Ravelry, which I will link below. It just has a modified garter stitch panel in the front, and by modified I mean there is 1 row of garter and there are 2 knit rows in between. So if you were to just have garter stitch, again, this is garter stitch in the round, so you have to purl to create these ridges on the front of the sock. And if you were to just alternate purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit rounds, garter stitch row gauge is so much denser vertically than stockinette stitch that if you did not have this additional knit row in between all of these garter ridges, the front of the sock would be like very squished and it might not fit your foot in the right way. But because of this additional knit round, it fits right in with the stockinette gauge on the back. I'm using a discontinued yarn from my stash that I think was one of the Valley yarns. It's a traditional superwash merino nylon blend. It feels like the about 460 yards per 100 gram type, if that gives you an idea of what type of yarn it is. And I mainly wanted to show you these today to show you how I do my toes on my socks, because it is a little bit non-standard. So here's the one in progress, and as you can see, I knit all of my socks pretty much from the toe up in magic loop. Like, when it comes to socks, I'm just not super adventurous anymore at this point. Like, I've knit very complicated socks, and it is just not the thing that I enjoy doing. When it comes to socks, I need something that's good for a Zoom meeting or good for watching an intense TV show or something like that, and everything else can be complicated, but I like the socks to be simple. So I don't know how easy it is for you to tell here, but I make my toes angled so that they actually are the shape of my foot. So I always end up with a right and a left sock. And so what this looks like is, this is the side where my big toe goes, and then my other toes are more angled. So I don't know how you guys feel, but I was one of those kids, and my sister is watching this, and I'm sorry that I was such a pain as a little kid, but I had some serious sensory issues around socks on my feet. And like the little seam at the end of the toe, if I could feel that in any way, or if the sock was jumbled up on my foot inside my shoe or whatever, absolutely nothing could go on in any of my family's lives until my sock was adjusted just so. And I still remember this. Like, this is probably, I mean, I was very little. One of my earliest memories is getting super worked up about the way my socks were jumbled up in my shoes. As an adult, I had gotten over that, but when I started making hand knit socks, I found it a little odd that all of the wedge toes are really just shaped like this on the sides, you know? Like, my toes aren't shaped like that. After I had made my first couple pairs of socks, so this was some years ago now, I decided, let me experiment with this toe shape a little bit to make it more like my actual foot is shaped. Wouldn't that be nice? So what I do is, if I were knitting this top down, I would just start decreasing on one side until I get to a certain number of stitches. It's usually 24 stitches, and then I start decreasing on both sides like a wedge toe. I have a free sock pattern available on Ravelry, which I will link below. I'll also type out just the instructions for the toe below in case you don't use Ravelry or don't want to bother. But so that is the top down version. For the toe up version, which is what I did here, I'm just going to verbally tell it to you. I cast on Judy's Magic Cast On, so where you can knit off of both sides. I cast on 10 stitches per needle. I increase every round until I get to 24 stitches per needle. And then at that point, I increase to my final circumference of the sock, only increasing on one side, front and back. So these, I usually do a 60 stitch sock for my shoe size. I wear a US 7. It's about a European 37. And so I will usually do a 60 stitch sock for the foot. Sometimes I'll increase a little bit on the leg, but most of the time, not even. Then on the other sock, if I'm knitting toe up, I do exactly the same thing, but I just make sure that when I start whatever pattern I'm having on the top of the foot, I just make sure that I'm making a left and a right sock instead of two right socks or whatever. I've had other very opinionated sock knitters say to me, well, don't you put your socks on the wrong feet? And it's like, I don't have any problem putting my shoes on the correct feet. So like, no, I just look at them and then I know which ones go on which foot. But so for me, I much prefer this to a wedge toe. If you're one of those people that has like sensory stuff with your feet, this might be a good solution. I've also found that having the toes shaped exactly like my foot means that I no longer wear out my socks in the toe. Like before, when the wedge toe was sort of getting like worked around my toe that is not shaped like a traditional wedge, that I would get this part of the sock where my big toe goes would get a hole in it. And now I don't get that at all anymore, and where my socks wear out is on the bottom of the foot. I'm always having to darn like right on the bottom of the foot, but that's something that I had to do anyway, even when I was sort of busting through the toes on the socks. So this is just what I do now. So those are my socks. I don't know if I will show them again when they're finished because they're just socks, but if you guys want to see them, let me know. The last colorwork item that I have to show to you today is a new sweater that I cast on, and I sort of cast it on a little bit of a whim. Like, I had been planning it for a couple years and I knew I wanted to make it at some point, and for some reason I just decided to cast it on. I also have another fingering weight colorwork sweater in the works that I'm doing like a separate video series on, and I'm also about to start the Marie Wallen Fair Isle Club, which is also fingering weight colorwork sweater. But this one, for whatever reason, felt like the right time a couple weeks ago to cast it on. This is probably going to be a little bit of a longer term project for me. So this is from the Susan Crawford book, The Vintage Shetland Project. I was able to purchase this book on sale from the Woolly Thistle. Every now and again it goes on sale at that store in particular, and I nabbed it the last time it was on sale there. So it's an expensive book. It's worth seeing if you can get it at your library just to check it out and see if it's something you would be into. I knew that I would be into this and that I would probably be making a lot of patterns from it, so I decided it was worthwhile to purchase it. The pattern that I am making is the Ralph sweater, and here it is shown on a male model. And at first when I saw this pattern, I was like, you know, that's nice, and wouldn't it be nice if my husband would wear something like that? He probably will not. I really liked just the sort of overall neutral color palette. I've been doing a lot of color for me lately, and so this is sort of my happy place, these sorts of colors. And I was like, oh, you know, that's such a nice, I like the very traditional X's and O's pattern here. I like the corrugated rib, multicolored corrugated rib. And I just thought, you know, I like this. So I had gotten this book a couple years ago now, and around that time I ordered the yarn for this pattern in the size that would be approximately this fit on me, so not super oversized. After I had ordered the yarn for that size, which I think was the second size, maybe the third, I was looking through the book again. I mean, I've looked through this book probably dozens of times at this point because it's just such a beautiful book. But I also started to really like, this is the exact same sweater, same sample, but just modeled on a small person. And I was like, oh, I love how that looks as an oversized, sort of more tunic length, like 20s style, 30s style, you know, very oversized fit on this model here. And I was like, I sort of want that size for myself. I decided to go up to the 5th size. The size I was originally planning to make was the 3rd size. So by going up to the 5th size, I needed to purchase a couple more balls of yarn. They are not exactly the same dye lot, but I'm just gonna work with it. So this pattern is sized for a 28-inch bust through a 54-inch bust, and that is to fit. So the chest circumference of the largest size is 55 inches, which could be better. Within that range, this pattern is broken up into 8 sizes. And so for me, to get a little bit of ease with my garment, the sizes that were an option for me, my hips are about a 38. So 38 inches, 37 to 38. And so I could have chosen the 4th size, which has a hip circumference. I'm looking at the chest circumference here, but if I want it to fit in that oversized way, I really need to be budgeting for my hip circumference since my hips are larger than my bust. So the circumference of the 4th size is 39.5 inches, and I was not totally sure if that would give me enough ease at the hip to be comfortable. 1.5 inches, you know, if I happened to gain weight or was wearing voluminous pants or, you know, whatever, 1.5 inches ease at the hip might not be quite enough. So I decided to go up to the 5th size, which is 44. And that I am starting to get worried is going to be too much ease. I also don't want to look like I'm just flapping around in this giant colorwork sweater, but I'm honestly not entirely sure how I will feel about that fit. At this point, I've cast on and started, so let me show it to you. Here's what I've got so far. I cast on for that 44-inch circumference and knitted the corrugated rib here, and I'm through the first 3 motifs and into the second sort of caramel colored motif. And you will see how beautiful this fabric looks because I actually pressed this with my iron already. And the reason is I started this to practice using my Shetland knitting belt. This is made out of leather. You wear it around your waist and it's filled with horsehair. And so when you put your extremely long double-pointed needle into one of these holes, it enables you to not use your right hand to really support the knitting at all. It's ended up being very similar to like lever knitting or Irish cottage style knitting, which I've also done a video on before. Like the motion of knitting with the knitting belt is very similar to that. So if you like that knitting style, you might try a knitting belt if you're just looking to experiment. These are the things that are difficult to find. So these are the extremely long double pointed needles, which you need if you're doing garments. These are 40 centimeter needles, I think. Yeah, 40 centimeter. They're very difficult to find. I have only been able to order them from shops in either Germany or in the UK, and the sizes are limited. At one point back when I got the knitting belt, which was a couple years ago, I had ordered all of these smaller sizes, so like a 2.0 to 3.5 millimeters. I think I have all of the half sizes in there. One thing that I think is funny is that they tried to put the US sizes on them, but the US sizes don't actually correspond to the actual millimeter size of these needles. So I appreciate that they tried for US knitters, but go by the millimeter size if you're actually trying to buy these things. For the gauge that I needed to get for this size, I needed a 2.5 and a 3.0 millimeter needle. So I have those here. And I knit the first, the rib and the first two motifs using the knitting belt, but it felt like my tension was a little bit all over the place. Like it felt alternately too tight in some areas and too loose in others. Like I was just not sure that it was gonna block out. And so I didn't actually wet block this, but I did the same steaming with the iron technique I described for the Marie Wallen, and I just steamed it to make sure that all of this work that I did here wasn't going to need to be pulled out because of my tension, and it is fine. It's totally fine. There were a lot of lumps and bumps in here that really are not an issue. Like it's very smooth fabric now. I'm really happy with how this looks. But in the meantime, I had switched back over to just knitting with a circular needle. So I may go back to the knitting belt and I may not. I'm still in the process of getting used to it, and so it doesn't feel very fluent yet, and I had been getting a little bit frustrated. But now that I'm about to have so many colorwork jumpers on the needles, I might, like, maybe this can be my knitting belt project and I'll just do a little bit at a time. So that is the Ralph sweater, which you may or may not see again for a little while. Also, just to show you, I am using colors exactly as prescribed in the pattern by Jamieson and Smith. So it's just their regular 2-ply jumper weight. Here is the range of colors. I do find there to be not quite enough contrast between this one and this one, but it's okay. In the pattern, it's very subtle. Not everything has to be high contrast, right? I keep telling that to myself. The second to last whip I have to talk to you about is the Two Sisters shawl by Carol Sunday. This is something that has been in my queue for an extremely long time, and I just took a trip and I felt the need to cast something on before the trip, and like the sock wasn't going to be enough to take. Of course, I took the sock and didn't work on it at all. I only worked on this shawl, but I had been wanting to cast it on. I had the yarn in my stash and I decided, let's go ahead and do it. The yarn I'm using for this is Berroco Cosma, which is discontinued unfortunately, although it was relatively recently discontinued, so you can probably still find this. It is 60% baby alpaca, 30% wool, and 10% silk. And so it's very soft. It's very round. It's a sport weight, but I would argue that it could be a fingering. You can knit this at a variety of gauges, I think. It's going to be very drapey because of that alpaca content. I have knit a scarf out of this before and it was very nice. I think it would also be nice for like a very drapey cardigan, but there is no memory to this stuff. It's very rigid, like there's basically no give to this stuff at all. Any give that you're seeing is just like my finger skin moving. Honestly, it's almost like knitting with linen, the way this stuff is spun. I sort of understand why it's being discontinued because it's not super enjoyable to knit with, but it creates a beautiful finished item. The thing that I found the most intriguing about this shawl is its shape. So here is the schematic, and you can see it's sort of this weird mirrored wing shape. See, we have a couple of different lace patterns here and here, and then there's sort of like a traveling cable pattern. So I chose this yarn for this project because I wanted something that was very round that would make this traveling cable stand out. And I also thought that for this sort of textural all over lace, something that was a very round yarn would also work for that. Ordinarily for lace, the conventional wisdom says to choose something like a 2-ply because those yarns are going to have more drape due to the structure of the yarn. But because this yarn has a ton of drape, I mean, you can see the behavior of the skein a lot of times will give you a clue about how the yarn is going to behave on its own in the garment. Also has to do with how tightly your skein is wound, like I understand that, but this yarn is so floppy, it's definitely going to drape well in something like a lace pattern. I suspect another reason this yarn might not have been selling super well is because the color names have little to do with the actual color of the yarn. Like, I find this to be a rust color, not a pink, but I think the name for it was zinnia. I had purchased this online and it didn't look anything like what I thought I was getting. I liked it, but it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, you know. So I did not get very far, but I have done enough so that you can see a little bit of the pattern. Am I showing you the wrong side? Yes, I am. Here's the right side. And so you can see there are so many things to be excited about in this pattern. There is a picot edge along one edge only. So every now and then at the beginning of the row, you do one of these little picots, which when the finished project is blocked, you'll see those standing out just along the one edge. And you have this big sister pattern, which is what she calls it, just here. Then you have a little 1/1 twist cable running along here. You have what she calls the waves pattern. You have another 2/2 cable here. And then you have the little sister lace pattern. And then there's just a nice edge pattern here. Gives you a nice, there's like a slit stitch situation over here. There's a lot of variety in this pattern, which I love. There are some techniques in here that I have never seen done before, and I think they're really cool. Like, one example of that is the way that she writes this lace pattern here has you doing 2 yarn overs right next to each other in like a very special way. Like, there's what she calls an afterthought yarn over that's made sort of like a make one left or make one right style, where you pick up a strand from below and make a yarn over, an afterthought yarn over, as if you had done it in the previous row, and then you do a regular yarn over right next to it before going on. And so it makes, like, ordinarily you're not able to do lace that is this holy, that looks this sort of complex, without doing lace on the wrong side row as well. But by having that afterthought yarn over and the yarn over next to each other on the right side row, you can just purl back on the wrong side, and it makes it really pleasant to do that. I don't love doing lace on both the right and wrong sides, so that's something that I really like about this. And the other thing that I am really just filled with joy about is how beautifully this pattern is written. It is so simple and it's laid out in such a smart way. I have really been obsessed with Carol Sunday's patterns for a long time, with just the aesthetics of them. I can't remember if I've ever made one before, but I've favorited many of them over the years. Getting into them now, like, I really see how intelligent they are, and it just fills me with joy to be knitting a pattern that is so smartly laid out. There is no superfluous information. It's like one of those simple patterns from the old days, but more clear. And that is like my style right now. And so what you end up doing, like the way the pattern is written, it doesn't get super detailed about how to do these decreases here. It just says, like, you decrease every X rows as you're going, and just keep going until you've gotten approximately to this center point length. And so it almost doesn't matter what gauge you're getting. And then then you just reverse and you start increasing along that edge instead. So this is really cool. Like, and then you don't have a whole bunch of fabric bunched up at your neck here. And, you know, sometimes you want that in a shawl and sometimes you don't. And I think that this shape is very unusual and is going to be interesting to wear. Obviously, this is something that's probably going to take me a while at this point too, since I have so many projects on the needles, but it's a lot different than the other things that I have going on, so I'll probably just work on this here and there. The last whip that I have to share with you today is a test knit that I just started, and it's not a closed, like, secret test knit or anything, but I'm just not very far in it. I'll talk more about the test knit itself once I'm a little bit further into the project, but I wanted to talk about the beginning of it now because it concerns tubular cast-ons. So this project is a vest, a sleeveless vest. It's worsted weight yarn, and the designer has recommended that we start with a long tail tubular cast-on for 2x2 rib. I'm not one of those people that get super hyped about tubular cast-ons. I know that there are some people that just go bonkers for them and put them on everything and think that they're the best thing ever, and to each their own. I'm sort of ambivalent about them. I think I maybe have like an old school taste sometimes when it comes to things like the long tail. Regular long tail cast-on is sort of my go-to go-to, and I don't have a problem with how that looks. But for this one, the designer's recommending it. I'm doing a test knit, so I figured, what the hell, I'll go ahead and do it. The designer had linked to an Isolde tutorial, which I think is really good, and it's publicly available. So just like Isolde's long tail tubular cast on tutorial is what we're using for the pattern. And so I started off, so the pattern is written for worsted weight yarn. You start off with a US 5, which is a 3.75 millimeter needle for the rib, and then you are to switch to one size bigger for the body. And so you start at the bottom, you cast on at the hem and go up, and here is my first iteration. You'll notice this is off the needles because I did redo this, but I used that 3.75 millimeter needle for both the cast on and for knitting the rib, and I got way too far into this before really making the decision that I didn't like how this tubular cast on looked. Now, I don't think this is an issue with the tubular cast on itself. I've done the tubular cast on where you provisionally cast on and you knit a couple rows and then you sort of do a 3-needle bind off technique to create that folded edge. I have done, is it the Italian tubular cast on? There's like a provisional cast on where you do half of the number of stitches and then you do some increasing on your first couple setup rows and something like that. You end up pulling the provisional yarn out of the bottom of the tubular cast on at the end. I've done that one before. And I have done this long tail tubular cast on before. I think that this version is actually my favorite, but I think it's important to use a smaller needle for that first initial cast on and the 2 setup rounds than you are actually using for your rib. Because as you can see here, I used the 3.75 needle to cast on and do my 2 setup rows, and then also for my rib. And as you can see, like the bottom of this just doesn't look great, you know? And 2x2, so the tubular cast on I think is really best for a 1x1 rib. 2x2 is okay. You have to do some rearranging of stitches, so it always ends up sort of pulling these. The first row always looks a little bit wonky in my opinion for a 2x2 rib tubular cast on, but this was just really looking too disorganized for my taste, and so I was like, ugh, like what can I do? This is too loose, right? So I decided, well, I'm just gonna go down 1 additional needle size for this first cast on and the 2 setup rows, and then I'll switch to my 3.75 for this rib. So I recast on this morning, and as you can see, this looks significantly better. So for this one, I used a 3.5 needle to do the cast on and set up rows, and then I switched on the first real rib row to the 3.75 needle. And I think that this looks as good as it's gonna get at this point. Yeah, you can see the top one is just a little bit too loose. And, you know, it was minor, but I was like, oh, if I am looking at it, like I kept looking at this one and getting a little bit, like I kept getting that look on my face, you know, like, I don't like that. And I knew if I was gonna be doing that for the entire test knit, I should just stop and figure out what I was gonna do to rectify it. I wish I hadn't knit quite this much rib before making that decision, but you know, sometimes that happens. So I also want to talk a little bit about this yarn because it is, I'm having like a religious experience with this stuff. This is from Blackberry Ridge Woolen Mill in Wisconsin, and it is as close as one can get to like a very beautiful hand spun out of a mill spun yarn. I went out to this woolen mill to visit and to talk to the owner, Anne, and so I was just in Wisconsin last week visiting this mill. And so here is what their tag looks like for their yarn. This stuff, you guys, it is, and I am not exaggerating here, it is probably the most beautiful yarn that I have ever worked with. What makes me say that? So maybe part of it is that I was there at the mill. I witnessed this machinery working, doing its thing. The machinery at this mill ranges from the pieces of the card are from 1904 and 1905 up through, there's maybe a piece from the 60s. And so it's all just this beautiful old equipment, yarn being made in this old way. And it's very similar to the setup that they have at Green Mountain Spinnery, which also makes beautiful yarns, don't get me wrong. The owner of this mill is a hand spinner, and she's been doing this for many, many years. And you can just tell from the way this yarn is that she has just an intimate understanding of what knitters want and also what this type of yarn should be. This is her, what she calls medium weight. It's about a worsted weight yarn. And this particular color is, I think, bronze, dark bronze. And it has beautiful depth of color. They do dye this there in relatively small batches, but the dye jobs are very even. And you can see that there's a lot of depth in this yarn, and if I look closely I can see that it has some gray fiber in it, so this bronze, dark bronze color has been laid over a white and gray yarn, and it just creates this beautiful depth of color here. And so when I look at the structure of this yarn, I'm just pulling out a length for you to see, it looks like what I am aiming for when I am hand spinning. And so this is woolen spun. So I don't know if you can see the twist angle on this yarn, but it is as though the singles have like a very light hand on them, and then there's like a nice firm ply. I mean, that's how I would get this if I were hand spinning. This is what I'm always aiming for when I'm hand spinning. And the fact that she has been able to create it on mill equipment like this yarn is not particularly, I mean, I would not consider this thick and thin by any means. It's definitely a worsted weight, it's definitely consistent, but it's like got personality. You know what I mean? Is that coming across? I really hope that it is, because this stuff is so special. This is not sponsored. I purchased this myself. I'm just having such a great time knitting with it because it's creating such a beautiful fabric that has so much personality. You can see the depth of color, you can see that there is some variation in the actual base yarn, and you can also see like this isn't just a flat, this is stockinette obviously. Knitting this here at about 5 stitches per inch, which is probably the tightest I would try to knit this yarn. It seems like I mean, it's beautiful at this gauge, but I wouldn't want to knit it too much tighter than this. It could definitely go looser, like 18 stitches over 4 inches or so. But you can see, even though this is stockinette, the surface of the fabric has so much life in it. It's like just enough variability to be interesting to the eye. I'm just obsessed, honestly. I almost don't want to crow so much about this yarn because I want to buy all of it for myself. Anne is in the process of retiring and phasing out. So she is still making yarn, but it's not going to be going on forever. And she has a website that is a little bit older school, but it is worth navigating for this yarn. If you are interested in trying it out, I can highly recommend this medium weight. I also have some of her sport weight woolen silk coming. I bought 4 skeins of this and 4 skeins of her woolen silk, and she's shipping the rest of it to me because I was flying and didn't want to carry it with me on the plane. So that is coming soon, so I will show that when it arrives. You guys know I'm not like into big acquisitions and showing that type of thing, but this yarn is so special that I wanted to show it because it's really like at the forefront of my mind thinking about this type of yarn and using it, working with it in these projects. So this is not sponsored, but I'm really a big admirer of Anne and what she's doing. So if you want to pop over to her website, I will link it below. It is well worth trying this stuff out. So that is what I have for you today. The next episode, I have no idea which ones of these projects you will be seeing again because I am about to start that Marie Wallen Fair Isle Club project, and I'm not really a big like go with the group and do lots of things together type of person, but for some reason I decided to do this Fair Isle Club and give it a go. So I am gonna try to keep up with that, and we'll see how it goes. So you might be seeing some of that in the next episode. You will definitely be seeing this Blackberry Ridge yarn again because that test knit is due by the end of March, so I'll have to be working on that, and I will definitely show that to you. The other things, who knows? You'll see them when you see them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!